welcome to another DM Tips video. I'm Josiah, your host, also known as Dungeon Dad, and today we're going to be talking about a subject that almost every DM has struggled with at one time or another, and that is dealing with massive combat. Everyone loves the idea of a big epic battle, the clashing of swords, the thunderous war cry of the orcs barreling down through the mountains as you brace yourself to defend against them, the epic speeches that rouse morale and ready the men for fighting. But something that should be awesome and very memorable often turns into a slog. It can become uninteresting and basically devolves into this thing that the party just feels they have to get through before they can move on with the story. So today I'm going to show you how I handle massive combat. Again, like I say at the most of my DM Tips video, this is by no means the be-all end-all of dealing with massive combat in your game. However, I do hope that you find some of these tips helpful, and if my methods also work for you, then that's great. So I'm just going to get right into it. The first mistake a lot of DMs make is trying to map out where all the specific units and armies are on the battlefield. While it's a good idea to have a general understanding amongst the group where everything is happening, the actual battle itself should be more of a set piece for heroic moments that the characters can be involved with. Fighting through a horde of 100, 200, 300 plus enemies might seem appealing when you think of it like a movie. After all, when we watch Lord of the Rings or some other fantasy flick, you just see the heroes heroically charging through. Now imagine if every time one of those people, whether it be an enemy or one of our heroes, swings their sword, you have to stop and roll a dice, do math, and figure out how much damage it does. What seems cool when you picture it like a movie in your head ultimately looks like rolling a bunch of dice over a long period of time at the game table. The other alternative here is to kind of build units and make them fight each other, where the players control some groups of units while the enemies control others, but ultimately that is wargaming, which might be fun for some people, but that's not really what D&D is. That said though, if you do play in a group and everyone in the group also likes Warhammer, and maybe you just have a bunch of those miniatures sitting around, that could be an interesting way to resolve combat. Just get the appropriate units and run a game of Warhammer. But as far as a D&D campaign goes, where not everyone is going to be interested in that, it's not always the best option. Some players might be into it, but you'll also get others who don't really feel like this is what they signed on for, and to be honest, it isn't. What you want to do here is give specific obstacles that the party can deal with. So then the focus of the battle isn't so much them just killing as many orcs as they can, contributing to the overall kill count of the army, but actually going in and doing a specific objective that will further the progress of the battle in their favor. I'll give you an example of what I mean here. Perhaps the group is part of an army that's attacking a fortress where the big bad evil guys made his residence. They have a lot of catapults or trebuchets lined up ready to lay waste to the walls, but they can't really do much. The reason for that is because there's an arcane shield protecting the outermost walls of the fortress. It would be suicide for the army to just rush in and try to take it on with force. But one of the scouts has come back and discovered that there's a source of power that charges the shield. There's a large arcane crystal deep within the fortress that, if taken out, will allow the trebuchets to destroy the walls and the army to move in. Obviously, this task is more suited to a small surgical strike team, and that's where the party comes in. So this group of adventurers sneaks in through the back, possibly a door that isn't known to many others. Of course, actually finding an entry point could be part of the adventure here too. Once they get in, it's basically a dungeon crawl where they have to try to sneak through the fortress and take out this crystal and possibly the wizard who powers it. If they can do that and get back out before it's too late, they've then provided the first step in the succession towards victory their army needs. Ultimately, it's not up to you to decide exactly how they overcome the obstacle. Just put it in their path and then make it known that they need a way to get around it. Whatever they decide to do, at the end of the day, there are only two real outcomes here: success or failure. You need to prepare for what happens in both instances. And you just follow that chain of thought until one side has clearly won the battle over the other. If they do sneak in and destroy that crystal, what happens? Well, then the walls are destroyed and the army floods in. Then how does the enemy react? Perhaps they unleash a mighty monster they had captured and chained up in one of their holding cells. The party, being among the company of heroes that's kind of leading the vanguard, then has to deal with that monster while all this other fighting is happening around them. Again, it's using the battle as a set piece. They still feel like they're part of this big epic battle, but they have a focused goal, so it's not just swinging a million different attacks. If the party succeeds in quickly taking down this monster, then maybe that punches a hole where the rest of their forces are able to storm the throne room and catch the bad guys off guard. At this point, the battle is effectively won. But if they fail or just take too long in getting rid of this monster, maybe it gives time for the bad guys in the throne room to escape by some other means. This of course allows them to regroup and the story continues. However, that battle is won. The possibilities here are pretty much endless and ultimately come down to what kind of battle is being held, as well as all the specific circumstances of your campaign. In general though, there are three main types of combat. We've got a situation where the party is defending, whether it be a fortress or a castle. They're in a position where they are the defenders against some force that's attacking. Or we've got the inverse of that, where the party is attacking some kind of stronghold or fortress, and they have to deal with the defense of the bad guys. And then of course the third option is just open conflict in the field of battle. I'm going to take a moment here to talk about each kind of massive combat you might encounter and how to prepare for it and some things you might want to think about. When the party is in a fortified position, there are a lot of things to consider. For starters, how long do they have to prepare before the enemy is coming? Or do they even know the enemy is coming at all? If they do have prep time, let the party make their defenses. Of course, there's going to be the basic walls and gates and all that stuff, but what other measures does the party take to prepare? And depending on what they do here, they might be able to buy themselves a bit of advantage during the first phase of the combat. If the party makes good choices here, ensure that you're actually taking the time to describe how those defensive measures are improving their odds as the battle continues. And depending on what they do here, maybe it'll change up the way the opening combat starts and it might be not as difficult for them. The other thing you'll want to think about is how much the enemies know about the stronghold the players are trying to defend. If there are secret passageways in and out, do the enemies know about that? If there are certain spots in the wall that are their weakest point, do the enemies know about that? How much do the enemies know about what kind of soldiers are defending the fort? The less knowledge they have, the better it is for the party. So preemptively, maybe a few nights before, they could see scouts on the horizon, or there might even be a traitor amongst their own ranks who tries to leave to convey that knowledge to the enemy force. If they can stop that from happening, it might give them a bit of an advantage because the enemy knows less about them. Basically, everything the enemy knows is fodder for you to make another stumbling block for the party. Another thing too that could happen here is a siege. Siege warfare is incredibly common throughout the Middle Ages. And if that seems like the best option, the enemy is absolutely going to do that. If the party is sieged, what happens when they run out of resources? Maybe they have to start sending out small raiding bands to try and steal resources from their enemy. Or maybe the party is actually sent away on a diplomatic mission to get the help of a nearby kingdom to come and break the siege. And what does the party do with any non-combatants? If the place they're defending is a military fortress and there's only soldiers there, that does simplify things a bit for them. But if they're trying to hold the city or anywhere where common folk might live, what do they do with all the non-combatants? Do they have a shelter set up where these people can go during the battle? And if the party should fail, do these people have a way to get out? If the battle starts turning against them, is there an escape route for the non-combatants or even for the party themselves? Or are they going to be backed into a corner where they're basically forced to fight to the death? If the bad guys do manage to capture the last remaining survivors of the good guys, which the party is a part of, do they simply try to kill them? Or do they take them as prisoners, send them off to a slave camp? You have tons of different options here, and it's good to think about this stuff before you actually have to make that choice in the moment. Now, when the party is on the attacking side of this situation, trying to break a fortress, you basically want to consider all of that, but in reverse. How much do they know about their target? What kind of siege weapons do they have to deal with a wall or any defenses that the enemies might have? And what kind of surprises might the defenders have in store? Are they going to throw down boiling pitch on them when they're trying to break through the front gate? Do they have particularly skilled archers who might be able to hit them from a distance away? And most importantly, does the enemy know they're coming? A battle is much more difficult if the enemy has days or weeks ahead of time to prepare. They can stock up food, they can bolster their defenses, strengthen the weak points of their walls, whatever they need to do. Whereas if you manage to sneak up on them, you might be able to take them quick and fast. No siege required. What is probably the rarest kind of battle in Dungeons & Dragons, at least, is a battle in an open field. I still want to cover it though because there is a chance that this might come up. Typically, if battle is held out in the open, it's because the location where the battle is taking place is of some importance. So it's up to you to decide, why is that place important? You also want to think about what the landscape is like. Does the party get to set up their troops on a hill, thus giving them the high ground? Are there places where they can set up ambushes? Is there a tree line? Do they have the option of hiding siege weapons like catapults or ballista behind it? The environment's always important, but in an open conflict like this, it's pretty much the most important thing. Now, the downside of this kind of battle is you have less options for objective-based missions that you can send the party on. So here you're going to want to focus more on the narrative of the battle and big targets. I don't mean physically big targets, although it might be a physically big target, but just enemies that are important to defeating in order for the party to win the battle. Because that's ultimately what this kind of combat generally looks like in D&D. Maybe the enemy has a cloud giant on their side and the party is going to take them down to help sway things in their favor. Or maybe there's an elite vanguard of units, maybe 10 strong, that the party needs to take out because they're just killing everything around them. One option you do have here, which technically you can use in any battle but works very well in the open conflict scenario, is that of a duel. Single combat in the midst of battle seems almost ridiculous when you think about it, but it's something that actually happened throughout history. If there were two champions that met in the field of battle, oftentimes the lesser common soldiers would step back, literally forming a circle to let those two champions fight. And the other soldiers wouldn't intervene and start fighting again until one of the champions was killed, obviously demoralizing their side to a huge degree. But this is a good chance for you to let maybe one of your more renowned fighter characters shine. If you have a paladin, barbarian, or fighter in the party, maybe throughout this war or their adventures they've become kind of famous. An equally famous champion of their enemy steps forward and challenges them to a duel. Then they get to fight one-on-one and it lets that player have the spotlight for a minute. Alternatively, maybe you have two fighters or a paladin and a fighter, both renowned for their combat prowess. There's no reason you can't have maybe two champions step forward and they fight 2 versus 2. In any case though, this is a good chance to let those knightly characters have their moment in battle. And of course, if they fall, they might not necessarily die, or maybe they will, depending on how brutal your campaign setting is, but it will definitely count against the party as it will not only down that character, but also demoralize all of their allies. Open conflicts are definitely the hardest to do in practice. However, with enough pre-planning, they can be fairly memorable and just good encounters. With all this considered, I'm going to give you kind of a play-by-play example of what it might look like if I'm running a game where the party is defending against an undead horde. Stage 1 is pre-planning. That's when the party gets to bolster their defenses and figure out what they need to do before the undead arrive. Pretty self-explanatory. This is a good place for exposition though, if party members want to have good RP moments with each other or the townsfolk or other important NPCs who might be in the stronghold. So definitely don't overlook that. Stage 2. Stage 2 is the first wave of the attack. The undead start approaching the city and begin battering down the gates. Casualties are fairly minimal at this point, but there are some undead archers shooting at their guys on the wall. As some of their soldiers are starting to fall, there's a necromancer across the battlefield who is raising them as undead. This is making it much more difficult for them to hold the city walls as their own soldiers are rising up against them when they fall in battle. The party has got to eliminate this necromancer or at least find a way to stop what he's doing, otherwise they'll probably fail the first stage of the battle. How they do this is up to them. In this example, the party decides that they're going to get the wizard to cast invisibility on everyone. Then they can sneak around, get to where the necromancer is, kill him, and get back to the wall. They are successful in doing this, however, they took too long. The necromancer has raised too many bodies as undead, and the horde has begun to overtake the gates. Had they instead hallowed the bodies so they couldn't rise at all, or instead maybe tried to fly to the necromancer, things might have been a little different. Stage 3. The undead have now begun flooding the city. What remains of the vanguard, as well as the players, must retreat back to the castle and try to hold there. This is where I would use a skill challenge. As they were headed back, I would really paint the scene of the undead running amok in the streets, and the party is just bolting through the chaos to try and protect the castle. If you're not sure what I mean by skill challenge, I've talked about it in a couple videos before. You can see me talking about it when I did my video on the Wild Hunt, and I'll also link to a video in the description below from Matt Colville's channel where he talks specifically just about using skill challenges. But ultimately, it's a way for them to get there and still do things without having to just use their move speed and run. Anyways, in this situation, they succeed on their skill challenge and make it there just in time to seal the gate behind them, barring the undead from getting in. If they had failed here, the undead would have gotten into the castle courtyard before they had a chance to make it back. But since they succeeded, they have a second to catch their breath, regroup, and maybe heal a little bit. That is, of course, until we get to stage 4. A colossal skeleton wades through the ranks of the dead. The party has a couple rounds to prepare since they can see it coming and they got here in due time, but it will be upon them climbing over the castle walls within 3 rounds. When it does so, a few dozen undead also manage to make their way over by hanging onto the colossal skeleton's ribs and arms. The rest of the soldiers are preoccupied with repelling the undead and fighting off some of the zombies that just made their way inside. So it falls to the party to deal with the colossal menace before them. In this situation, the party unfortunately cannot handle the task. Had they repelled the creature here, they may have been able to stave off the undead forces indefinitely. But this time, they just couldn't quite do it. The party drags their wounded friends into the throne room, and the rest of the soldiers that are still alive anyways gather and prepare for their final stand. Now this brings us on to stage 5. Fortunately for the living, there is an underground passage in the throne room meant to escape in just this kind of situation. It's a winding passage of tunnels that are only 5 to 10 feet wide in some spots that hasn't been traversed in ages. But this time, it'll do the job. First, they send the non-combatants through, and then the soldiers will follow behind them to guard the rear. But just as this is happening, one of the massive wooden doors that leads into the throne room bursts open and undead start pouring through. The party decides to try and hold them off, saving the most amount of people they can before they're forced to flee themselves. I tell them it's going to take 4 rounds for the majority of people to get to safety, and they choose to stand and fight for those 4 rounds. They are successful in surviving for those 4 rounds, and they follow behind the peasants, sealing the way behind them. Notice here that I never take away choice. You want to give the party problems, and then leave it up to them to come up with the solution. They could have just fled as soon as the doors were open to that underground passageway. However, if they had done that, a lot more innocent people would have died. So maybe you have a situation like this where they do flee, then you have to decide what are the repercussions. At the end of the day, in this situation, the party makes it out mostly intact. However, they have suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of their enemies. Despite this though, they still get to feel like heroes. Everyone they saved will be eternally grateful to them, and even though the city was lost, what remains of the rulership, perhaps even the king, has nothing but good things to say about his newfound friends. What happens in the aftermath of a battle like this is totally up to you. This is a great way to set up recurring villains, because maybe that necromancer has claimed this town as his necropolis, and should the party decide to go back, they might be able to fight him at a later date. This also changes the political and sometimes physical landscape of your world, which can always be interesting. Another thing you want to think about here is what the battle was named. Battles, both in fantasy and history, always have names. So taking the time to come up with an interesting name that kind of gives a glimpse into what that battle was like is always fun. In the course of any battle, you also want to have that one wrench to just throw in their plans to mix things up a bit. Maybe one of their trusted allies actually betrays them and turns out to be in league with the enemy. Maybe they were promised aid from another kingdom and they never showed up. All that we've talked about today are just things to consider when setting up this battle. That's basically my input on massive combat, and I really hope that this helped you out if you were struggling with a situation where you had a big battle coming up in your campaign. If you did find this video interesting and you like what I do here, please subscribe to the channel. I have at least 1 or 2 new videos every week. And of course, check out the description below. We've got all that good social media stuff, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, everything of your wildest dreams. I do also have a Patreon set up now as well, so if you'd like to support the channel in that way and you're able to, please consider taking a look there. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. It really means a lot to me that you keep coming back to my channel to see what I'm talking about. So thanks a bunch, and I'll see you next time.